There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But there are also unknown knowns. We are the ancient and esoteric order of the Jackalope, a secret society devoted to unearthing and sharing this forgotten knowledge. Hi folks, number 13 here, and I've now spent 22 continuous weeks here in the secret recording bunker, and I'm just about ready to lose it. So let's get this over with so I can go back to biting my nails down to the nub and peeling paint off the walls. Today's episode, We Live Inside, presented by number 13. Cyrus Reed Teed was born on October 18, 1839, in Trout Creek, New York. The Teed family was well off. So well off that the part of town where they lived was called Teedville. But Cyrus's immediate family was not. His parents, Jesse Teed and Sarah Tuttle, had 8 children to support and were barely getting by. In the early 1840s, the Teed family relocated to Utica to live with Sarah's father, a Baptist preacher, who took over young Cyrus's education. The goal was to train Cyrus for the ministry, but unfortunately the family's financial needs were more pressing. In 1850, 11-year-old Cyrus dropped out of school to become a hoggee, or towpath driver, on the Erie Canal. It was a boring job, driving oxen along a straight road for 8 months of the year, but it had one upside. It gave young Cyrus to indulge in his favorite hobby, reading, and he read every book he could find on topics as diverse as philosophy, history, and science. Freed from the influence of his grandfather, Cyrus developed a stubborn independent streak. At the age of 20, Teed married Fidelia Rowe, a distant cousin, who was soon pregnant with her only child, Douglas Arthur Teed. Then, he shocked his family by turning his back on the church and apprenticing with his uncle, Dr. Samuel Teed, a practitioner of eclectic medicine. Eclectic medicine was a populist reaction to the increasing professionalization and scientification of the medical field. It was a loose alliance of doctors who couldn't understand the new medicine and felt left behind, and doctors who were opposed to treatments like bleeding, purging, and pharmaceuticals on both moral and intellectual grounds. In practice, it was a strange hodgepodge of what we'd call alternative medicine today, mostly ineffective methods of treatment like folk medicine, herbalism, homeopathy, and osteopathy. Some practitioners even dabbled in fields like alchemy, mesmerism, faith healing, and other outright quackery. In 1862, Teed briefly put his studies on hold to enlist in the Union Army. His service was short. In August 1863, he collapsed from sunstroke while on maneuvers and developed a psychosomatic paralysis in his left leg. He spent 2 months in the field hospital, was eventually declared unfit for duty, and discharged. Teed finished his studies in 1868, receiving a doctorate from the Eclectic Medical College of the City of New York. The newly minted Dr. Teed moved back to central New York to open a practice in Deerfield. He went all in on advertising, painting the outside of his office with giant letters declaring, "He who deals out poison deals out death," a not-so-subtle dig at the pharmacist just down the street. Dr. Teed's specialty was electroalchemy, or alchemovietism, the treatment of ailments through the application of powerful electric shocks and magnetic fields designed to rebalance the body's humors. It was a strange fusion of cutting-edge science with ancient metaphysical ideals, and perfect for Cyrus, who was also a strange combination of the world that had been and the world that was to come. He would treat patients at his clinic all day and spend the evenings tinkering with the electrical equipment in his lab trying to unlock the secrets of the universe. He hadn't left his old life behind, though. In 1869, Teed was formally baptized by his grandfather. When the Holy Spirit descended on him, he thought he heard a voice faintly calling to him. But surely, he must have been mistaken. In October 1869, Teed was working in his lab when he discovered the Philosopher's Stone. You heard me right. He discovered the way to convert base matter into purest gold. That would probably be enough for most of us, but not for Dr. Cyrus Reed Teed. He had to go further and conquer death itself. Here's what happened next, in Teed's own unique, florid, impenetrable gibberish.
I experienced a relaxation at the occiput or back part of the brain, and a peculiar buzzing tension at the forehead or sinciput. Succeeding this was a sensation as of a Faradic battery of the softest tension about the organs of the brain called the lyra, crura pinealis, and canarium. They gradually spread from the center of my brain to the rest of my body, and apparently to me, into the auric sphere of my being, miles outside of my body, a vibration so gentle, soft, and dulciferous that I was impressed to lay myself upon the bosom of this gently oscillating ocean of magnetic and spiritual ecstasy. I realized myself gently yielding to the impulse of reclining upon the vibratory seas of this, my newly found delight. My every thought but one had departed from the contemplation of earthly and material things. I had but a lingering vague remembrance of natural consciousness and desire.
Teed found himself floating in a void, unable to move or speak. He started to panic, thinking that his experiments had somehow severed his soul from his body. But he was calmed when the sweetest, most feminine voice began speaking to him. He was shocked to realize the voice was his own, and also the voice of God. Soon he was face to face with God herself, a gloriously regal, unutterably beautiful, majestic vision of womanhood. She revealed his true nature. Cyrus Reed Teed was the divine Horus, son of Osiris and Isis, the masculine aspect of the Godhead incarnate. He had been sent from the heavens time and time again to redeem the world, and each time he had strayed from his mission and been laid low by his enemies. This time, it would be different. Teed's experiment had interrupted the eternal cycle, giving him a rare glimpse of the spiritual world and the ability to transcend his fate. In this life, he would be reunited with the feminine aspect of the Godhead, and together they would save the world. God bade him farewell, and he found himself back on the earthly plane, lying on the cold floor of his laboratory. Teed came to the reasonable conclusion that he had knocked himself out with an electrical shock and had a strange dream. He climbed into bed next to his wife to sleep it off. But 3 times that night he was roused from his slumber by the sound of a great chariot flying above his house. As he stared at the ceiling, he could feel himself slowly attuning to the vibration of the entire universe and becoming one with the cosmos. He knew then it was all true. He was the Messiah. In secret, he began organizing the principles of his new religion. No, more than a religion, the ultimate fusion of religion and science. Like eclectic medicine, Teed's religio-science was a strange hodgepodge of primitive Christianity, Swedenborgian mysticism, spiritualism, and alchemy, with a healthy dose of millennialist paranoia thrown in for good measure. Teed rechristened himself Koresh, a Hebrew version of Cyrus, and called his new creed Koreshanity. Here's what he believed. God was a perfect biune being with male and female aspects. Cyrus Reed Teed was the male aspect of the Godhead incarnate and the Messiah. He had been reincarnated several times as Adam, Enoch, Noah, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. This 7th incarnation was to be his last. Men and women, each representing a portion of the Godhead, were equitable, but not equal. Sex and marriage made women the slaves of men, which destroyed any equity between them. Consequently, everyone should be celibate and unmarried. Sexual urges should instead be sublimated into the worship of God, i.e., Dr. Cyrus Reed Teed. The end times were soon to be upon us. Once those refocused sexual energies had charged Teed's anthropostic battery, his consciousness would expand in theocrasis, and he would unite with the feminine Godhead, recreating the perfect biune form of God here on Earth. The new God would destroy our corrupt capitalist society, transform everyone into perfect hermaphrodites, banish death, and usher in a new golden age. This could be accomplished because matter and energy were one and the same, and one could be destroyed to create the other. By energy, he meant not only electricity and magnetism, but also spiritual energy. The Bible was a true expression of the divine mind, but was written in a symbolic, coded way that had to be interpreted by a prophet for mass consumption. Heaven and hell were not literal places, but spiritual conditions that existed solely within the mind. After death, souls were not rewarded or punished for eternity, but reincarnated in new physical shells. The cycle could only be broken by conquering death itself and achieving physical immortality. In the meantime, people should live like the primitive Christians. All property should be shared communally, and men and women should live apart. Now, most of these ideas were all fairly common in mid-19th century American religions. There was no shortage of cults proclaiming a new messiah, prophesying the end of the world, and calling for communal living, celibacy, and the equality of sexes. It was at least novel for one creed to profess all of these tenets simultaneously. But Teed had one more belief that set him apart from the crowd. The Earth is a hollow sphere. I mean, even that wasn't an entirely uncommon belief in the 19th century. Many intelligent people believed that there were giant openings at the north and south poles through which the hidden lands of the inner Earth could be accessed. There's an excellent episode of The Constant that talks about this. I'll share the link on our website. But Teed added his own twist that made it truly unique. The Earth is a hollow sphere, and we live on its inside surface. In Teed's cosmology, the cellular cosmogony, the entirety of the universe is a hollow sphere with a 17-layer crust 100 miles thick. The outermost layer consisted of a thin shell of pure gold, and the innermost layer was the world we see around us. In the center of this system was an invisible electromagnetic battery that powered everything. The sun, moon, and stars were all illusions, caused by mercurial mirrors reflecting the light of the invisible battery onto the Aberon atmosphere of the heavens. The sphere was all that was, and outside of it, there was nothing. The cellular cosmogony was born from the same existential dread of an infinite universe that inspired horror writers like H.P. Lovecraft. Unlike Lovecraft, Teed could not succumb to this dread. To him, the whole purpose of science and philosophy was to study the universe in order to know God through their works. If the universe was infinite, it was impossible to know God, because you could never know all their works. So Teed denied that an infinite universe existed, and created a comforting, self-contained one to take its place. He declared,
"To know of Earth's concavity is to know God, while to believe in the Earth's convexity is to deny him and all his works."
So to summarize, a 30-year-old quack in upstate New York accidentally knocked himself out with an electric shock. When he recovered, he declared that he was the Messiah, that God was a hermaphrodite, that the world was coming to an end, and that you should stop having sex and give away all your money and property. And oh yeah, we lived on the inside of a hollow earth. Folks, it only gets weirder from here. Needless to say, Cyrus Reed Teed could not keep the good news to himself. He started preaching his new creed to anyone who would listen, and quite a few who wouldn't. Teed was a commanding, charismatic orator, but he could not convince the good people of Deerfield and Utica that he was the Messiah. Let's face it was a tall order. They'd known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. If the neighbor's kid came to you and told you he was really the Son of God, would you believe him? Teed was dismissed by his neighbors as a crank, a narcissist with a God complex, or a simple lunatic like his brother Wilson who talked to spirits and electrical wires. It didn't help that Teed decided to step up his critique of mainstream Christian denominations, which he considered the degraded tools of our capitalist oppressors.
"Christianity, so-called, is but the dead carcass of a once vital and active structure. It will rest supine until the birds of prey, the vultures and cormorants of what is falsely called liberalism, have picked its bones of its fleshly covering, leaving them to dry and bleach and decompose."
Teed's aggressive proselytizing quickly turned him into a social pariah. The Baptist kicked him out of the congregation, and his patients started seeing other doctors. On the brink of financial ruin, he moved his family to Binghamton to make a fresh start. It also allowed him to sponge off his in-laws who lived nearby. In Binghamton, he made a new friend, Dr. Abiel W.K. Andrews, or Aby. Aby was a local doctor, a real one, a fellow war veteran, and he found Teed intelligent, quick-witted, and fascinating. They spent many an evening having lively and earnest arguments about philosophy and religion. In the course of these arguments, Aby slowly became a convert to Koreshanity. He would be Teed's closest friend and confidant. But Andrews was the only convert he'd make in Binghamton. Southern New York had seen so many revivals that it was sick of new religions. Before long, they'd had enough of the new Messiah and quietly suggested he should leave town. This was the new pattern of Teed's life. He would move to a new town, hang out his shingle, and get to know the community. Then he'd get overconfident and start preaching to the locals. Eventually, he'd have to flee town before he could be run out of it on a rail. Then it was on to the next town. He spent the better parts of 2 decades crisscrossing New York and parts of Pennsylvania in this manner. When he was in between jobs, Teed would stay with the Andrews family, where he and Aby worked on strategies to create converts. They tried to identify groups that might be receptive to the Koreshan message so Teed could infiltrate them and spread the good word. They tried the Young Men's Christian Association, the Methodists, countless others to no avail. Since the Koreshan creed called for communal living, Teed and Andrews made a study of successful religious communes in preparation of eventually opening one of their own. They found much to admire and copy as they read about the Oneida community, the Shakers, the Harmony Society, the Brownstone Utopia of Stephen Pearl Andrews, and Thomas Lake Harris's Brotherhood of the New Life. Teed even visited the Shaker Enclave in Mount Lebanon and briefly became an initiate, though he never quite became a full member. His visit to the Harmony Society in Economy, Pennsylvania was less fruitful. Encouraged by their polite responses to his letters, he was convinced that he would take over the entire community with his fiery sermons and magnetic personality. Instead, the Society's trustees smiled politely and sent him on his way with a check for $100. Teed saw that as a personal insult and declared,
"When I am ready to use the people of economy for the divine use, I shall simply command, not beg."
That was a pretty bold claim for someone who could count his followers on one hand and have enough fingers left over to poke you in both eyes. And in fact, it's even worse than that makes it sound. Other than Aby, the only other converts to Koreshanity were Teed's younger siblings Emma and Oliver. He couldn't even convert his own wife and son. Fidelia Teed was not a fan of their family's new itinerant lifestyle. When she was diagnosed with tuberculosis in the mid-1870s, She used that as an excuse to take young Douglas and move in permanently with her sister in Binghamton. Koreshan biographers would have you believe that the separation was an amicable one and that Delia supported her husband's holy work. The course of their lives would seem to indicate otherwise. Cyrus rarely visited his family, barely bothered to write, and when Delia finally succumbed to her condition, Douglas was taken in not by his father or relatives, but by a wealthy local widow. In 1877, Teed made his first real attempt to start a commune at his parents' house in Moravia. It was a pretty sad commune since it consisted entirely of his own immediate family who were already pooling their incomes. Eventually, Jesse Teed decided he'd had enough of his son's tomfoolery and put an end to the whole thing. The next year, the Teed family started a business making mops. Cyrus, who was between jobs, was brought in to help manage the factory. He soon realized that mop making could be the economic backbone of a commune, the way that furniture making had been for the Shakers. He reestablished the commune and even managed to make 3 new converts, all married women who left their husbands to follow the new Messiah. Married women found Koreshanity strangely appealing. They didn't seem to care too much about anthropostic batteries or cellular cosmogonies, but the parts about equal rights, not having to have sex with their doltish husbands, and not being trapped in loveless marriages, they ate that up with a spoon. It didn't hurt that Cyrus Teed was a charming, handsome doctor with penetrating eyes and a sensual voice, or that he actually talked to them and took a personal interest in their problems. It was like having a gay best friend who was also sexy Jesus. The good people of Moravia were not happy to learn that Teed was sharing a roof with 3 women he was not related to. False rumors that the Koreshans practiced bigamy and free love started to circulate. Fortunately, before a lynch mob could form, the mop business failed, the commune collapsed, and Teed left town. This time, Teed wound up in Syracuse, where he opened the Institute for Progressive Medicine, specializing in electrotherapy for neurasthenia and hysteria. As those afflictions occurred almost exclusively in married middle-class women, he was guaranteed a steady stream of patients and potential converts. Alas, one of those patients proved to be his undoing. He had been treating a Mrs. Cobb for nervous prostration and managed to convince her to make a small donation to support his new commune, $20 from her pocketbook, a small ring, and $5 she pinched from her son's piggy bank. But once she was separated from the fast-talking doctor, she realized she'd made a horrible mistake. She went to the police and swore out a complaint against Teed for obtaining money under false pretenses. Teed's defense was that there were no false pretenses. He was the second coming of Christ. In 1885, he would transcend the mortal plane and return 50 days later to usher in the new millennium, and his followers would live forever. As you might expect, that defense did not fly with the good people of Syracuse, and Teed was savagely mocked by the press. And that was just for the Messiah stuff. If they knew about the hermaphrodite god, the sex batteries, and the hollow earth, it would have been much, much worse. It was Koreshanity's first real widespread publicity, and it was uniformly negative. With his name and reputation in tatters, criminal charges pending, and the threat of vigilante justice starting to rear its ugly head, Teed decided to cut his losses. He returned Mrs. Cobb's money and skipped town. A disappointing result, but Teed was finally starting to figure it all out. He decided to set up a base of operations somewhere bigger, New York City. Teed rented a small 3rd-floor apartment on 135th Street and set up a small commune with 4 women who followed him from Syracuse. It fell apart almost immediately. Eclectic medicine had fallen out of favor in the city, and Teed was struggling to find patients. His 4 followers were no help, contributing very little to the commune's financial needs. When they fell behind on rent, the women moved back upstate. Teed took smaller lodgings and tried to start over from scratch. He somehow managed to finagle an introduction to a group of intellectuals in Brooklyn, led by a prominent spiritualist named Mrs. Peake. He dazzled the group with his scientific knowledge of the human brain and his alchemovietic theories about its ability to channel psychic energy. Mrs. Peake was delighted. The spirits told her that with Teed's help, her group would form the nucleus of the bridal church and usher in a new age of communism. The spirits were right about that, but wrong about her involvement. Within a few weeks, Teed had taken over leadership of the group. This new platform allowed Teed to expand his range, and soon he had a weekly lecture at the Faith Healing Institute on 59th Street and was writing articles for its journal. Teed's strange brand of religioscience and feminism caught the attention of prominent suffragette Cynthia Leonard, who invited him to speak at her Science of Life Club. Teed was once again a splash, and he was invited to join. That did not sit well with the club's previous golden boy, Stephen Pearl Andrews. The same Stephen Pearl Andrews whose brownstone utopia Teed had admired from afar. Andrews thought Teed was trying to force him out and take over the club, the same way he had taken over Peake's group. He was right, but Teed never got the chance. Teed's activities with the Science of Life Club caught the attention of Elizabeth Thompson, a free-thinking society matron who collected scientists and philosophers the way some people collect art. She'd find some promising young thinker and offer them lodgings, a monthly stipend, and tailored suits in exchange for the publication rights to their works. She made that same offer to Teed, and he jumped on it. At first, it was a productive partnership. Thompson introduced Teed to her society friends in Washington, D.C. and Stamford, Connecticut. But Teed found himself creatively blocked, and after 9 months, he had nothing. So Thompson tried to get him to assist one of her other authors, who was writing a book about free love and non-vaginal intercourse. The thought of either revolted Teed, who soon found himself completely boxed out of Thompson's circle and without funds. He had to swallow his pride and write to his friend Abby, begging for enough money to buy a train ticket out of town. Just as things started to fall apart, Teed received a letter from Mrs. Thankful H. Hale. Mrs. Hale had heard him speak in New York and was impressed. She invited him to come speak at the September 1886 convention of the National Association of Mental Science in Chicago, all expenses paid. Teed could hardly say no to a chance to speak to a roomful of potential converts, and the phrase all expenses paid sounded pretty good to him too. Mental science was a strange adjunct to eclectic medicine, an attempt to add scientific legitimacy to some magical thinking that had been bubbling just under the surface of American thought for years, that the root cause of all your infirmities, whether it's physical, mental, social, or spiritual, is your own thoughts. The secular-ish manifestations of this concept include creative visualization, the secret, and the power of positive thinking. Its more overtly religious manifestations include faith healing and Christian Science. In fact, in 1886, that was the hot-button issue of mental science, whether to stay the course and seek scientific legitimacy or to fully embrace the straight-up spiritualism of Mary Baker Eddy. It was one of the issues to be settled at the convention. Other highlights included demonstrations of mind cures and faith healing, and lectures about the science of the brain. Teed first addressed the convention on Friday. It must have been a hell of a speech, because later that day he was elected president of the association, defeating Professor Andrew J. Swartz in a shocking upset. Not only had Swartz organized the convention, he was also the editor of Mental Science magazine, president of the Mental Science University, and founder of the Mental Science Church. Despite all that clout, he could not withstand the fiery force of the new Messiah's personality and his ability to make fast friends. Teed, of course, did not mention that he was the Messiah to the association. After 17 years, he'd finally learned that it probably wasn't the best start for a sales pitch. On Sunday, Teed closed out the convention with a barn burner of a lecture on the brain. He called the Bible the foundation of all science. He declared that all disease was caused by mistakes in thought, and backed it up with his scientific knowledge and bits of esoteric mysticism. He proclaimed that by understanding the brain and marrying science with faith, you could heal the body and eradicate death. As his finisher, he performed a faith healing on an obese woman who could barely walk. It brought the crowd to its feet. Teed's domination of the association was complete. Teed took note of his success, and this would be his new modus operandi: find a larger, more powerful organization and take it over from within. It rarely paid off, but when it worked, it paid off big. Over the next few months, Teed relocated his operations to Chicago and began transforming the National Association of Mental Science. First, he reorganized Mental Science University into the World's College of Life, opening up to women, offering courses in eclectic medicine, and awarding its graduates doctorates of psychic and pneumic therapeutics. He set up a publishing house to print his pamphlets, and a monthly newsletter, The Guiding Star, later the much catchier Flaming Sword. He also started his first real church, the Assembly of the Covenant, and a gateway organization for the curious, the Society Arch Triumphant. Together, these organizations form the nucleus of his new society, the Koreshan Unity. Things were finally starting to come together. He attracted new converts. As usual, many of them educated middle-class women sick of the monotony of marriage. One wag who attended a meeting wryly noted that the women disciples were all Marthas. There might have been one Mary. Teed also softened a bit, making one small change to his dogma. He conceded that his date for the Second Coming was somewhat premature and pushed it back 5 years to 1891, and then to 1893, and then to whenever. The Koreshans opened a full-fledged commune in Chicago in a 3-story building near College Place. It was unfurnished, and thanks to some cash flow problems, its residents could rarely afford luxuries like heating or food. They also opened a co-op, the Koreshan Bureau of Equitable Commerce, to begin the transition of our corrupt capitalistic society to a moneyless system based on social credits. He still managed to find trouble, though. In February, one of his students, Mrs. Renew Benedict, sought Teed's medical expertise for her bedridden husband, Fletcher. Teed declared that Fletcher would be fine. He gave him a quick laying on of hands and prescribed a hot bath and a short treatment of lobelia and gelsomine, both of which are mildly poisonous. But Fletcher would not be fine. Fletcher had pneumonia and died. Chicago authorities convicted Teed of practicing medicine without a license and fined him $300. Teed paid the fine and thanked his lucky stars that they hadn't charged him with murder. In October 1888, the Koreshan Unity held a grand convention in Chicago's Music Hall, which pulled in 40 converts all in one go. It was a grand triumph for the Koreshans, but the expense was incredible. In fact, Teed had spent most of the previous 2 years teetering on the edge of bankruptcy because he spent all of his money on printing pamphlets and pushing promotional efforts, like a religious version of a .com company. The only thing that saved him from ruin were the near-bottomless pockets of his wealthiest followers, like Wisconsin grocer Henry D. Silverfriend and Bertholdine Boomer, wife of a railroad tycoon. It's almost as if he forgot he had discovered the process for transforming base matter into gold. Anyway, it was pretty clear that Teed was terrible with money. That was about to change thanks to Mrs. Annie Ordaway. Ordaway was one of the first students of the World College of Life, and later its head. She was in many ways Teed's exact opposite. Teed was a gentle, feminine man. Ordaway was a brusque, masculine woman. Teed was a fanciful dreamer. Ordaway was tough and practical. Teed was charismatic. Ordaway was not. Soon, Teed had decided that Ordaway was the feminine counterpart whose coming had been foretold. He rechristened her Victoria Gradia and promoted her to dual associate preeminent of the Society Archtriumphant. To his inner circle, he announced that at the right time he would undergo theocrasis, and his spirit would enter Victoria's body, and the united being would become the universal mother-father. In the meantime, Victoria would be in charge of the tedious day-to-day operations of the church, while Teed took care of the visionary big-picture stuff. Victoria Gradia was not popular with the rank-and-file Koreshans of the Unity. They debated whether she was actually divine, was to become divine after theocrasis, or was just an empty vessel for Teed's divinity. They challenged her decisions, confronted her, and argued with her at every turn. Many histories attribute this resistance to a sort of natural cattiness or status-seeking inherent to large groups of women, which is sexist and reductive. Honestly, it's just the negative dynamic you see in any large dysfunctional organization. You hate the terrible middle managers you deal with on a daily basis, but not the terrible folks in upper management who you rarely interact with. We should also consider the possibility that it was entirely intentional. By choosing an uncharismatic successor, Teed removed any possibility that his authority might be usurped. In any case, Teed made his choice and stood by Victoria, even when it meant expelling followers like Thankful Hale, who had invited Teed to Chicago, or Lizzie Robinson, who had put a roof over his head when he first arrived. Some of the blame also has to lie with Teed's recruiting tactics. His approaches were oddly seductive, and more than one convert understood Teed's overtures to be sexual. He'd spend months wearing down the resistance of converts, promising them positions of power in the organization and freedom from the tyranny of marriage, and then dumped them into a situation where instead they had to deal with the tyranny of Victoria Gradia. Converts weren't the only ones who took Teed's overtures to be sexual. Angry ex-husbands swore out a constant litany of criminal complaints against him, sued him for alienation of affection, and even threatened commune residents with revolvers. Teed had momentum, though, and could not be stopped. He sent missionaries across the country and made converts in Baltimore, Detroit, Denver, Washington, D.C., and more. In Pittsburgh, he debated Charles Taze Russell, head of the Watchtower Society, to great acclaim. He had his greatest success in San Francisco, where he established another commune in the Castro he called Ecclesia, which was to be the Golden Gate hippocampus of the Koreshan Unity. The San Francisco press had great fun with Dr. Teed, casting him as a Svengali-esque lady lurer, but only raised local interest in Koreshan techniques further. Ecclesia would also turn out to be Teed's biggest headache. When the director of the commune, Professor Royal O. Spear, returned to Chicago in October 1891, his wife promptly informed him that Teed had made a pass at her, claiming that it wouldn't be adultery because he was God and could do no wrong. It was almost certainly a lie, but it worked. Spear and Teed had a huge falling out. Spear quit the Koreshan Unity and gave a series of largely incoherent lectures denouncing the Koreshans and revealing their secrets. Speer's biggest revelation was that Teed had been working for years to create a union of celibate societies, pulling together the Koreshanity, the Shakers, the Harmony Society, the Brotherhood of the New Life, and more. None of these groups were theologically compatible, but Teed foolishly thought he could reconcile their financial interests and paper over any cracks with his personal magnetism. He had made the greatest inroads with Pittsburgh's Harmony Society, who he had visited years earlier. At this point, the society had dwindled to a handful of members, and Teed's plan was to have a few key men join the organization and form a voting bloc that would install him as the new trustee and give him access to the society's vast fortune. One of these men was purportedly John S. Duss, the current junior trustee of the society. The resulting scandal scuttled the Union of Celibate Societies and rattled the Koreshans and Harmonists. There was probably never much of a plot to begin with. Teed had been sending people to work with the society and learn their methods, but none were ever made full-fledged members. Indeed, few people ever were. Duss had been sending money to Teed, but it was the same sort of mild financial support the society gave to many other charitable organizations. The most likely scenario was that Duss had been using the threat of a Teed takeover to create an external threat to distract his foes in the society. Though I should note that in his biography, Duss declared Teed's vision of a hollow earth was 100% scientifically accurate. Teed was happy to play along because it made him look wealthy and powerful, and therefore more attractive to potential converts. Speer also revealed one other thing, that noted spiritualist medium, stockbroker, and then presidential candidate Victoria Claflin Woodhull was employing a Koreshan as her personal secretary. Woodhull was one of the most controversial figures of the day and believed in universal suffrage, Marxism, free love, and legalized prostitution. But Koreshanity was a step too far even for her. The secretary was fired, and she publicly denounced Teed. As part of the fallout from the Speer scandal, Teed decided to close Ecclesia and relocate all of its 60 residents to Chicago. The College Place commune had been barely adequate for its 30 residents and couldn't handle more. The Koreshan Unity wound up renting a mansion in Washington Heights that Teed rechristened Beth Ophrah. His inner circle moved into the mansion's relative luxury, while the other communards were moved into a dilapidated tenement 7 miles away in Normal Park. At this point, the Chicago Evening Journal started to stir the Unity's new neighbors into a NIMBY-ish frenzy. They established a vigilance committee to keep the Koreshans out of their neighborhood. Rocks were thrown at the house, and bombs were even left outside on the sidewalk. When Teed was arrested for alienating the affection of one Mrs. Thomas Cole, the vigilance committee held a rally in Normal Park calling for him to be tarred, feathered, and run out of town on a rail. When the Cole case went to trial, they tried to knock Teed down the courthouse steps and kill him. The Cole case was eventually thrown out of court by a judge who got tired of Cole's constant attempts to postpone it. Cole finally got his day in court in 1897, but what he thought would be damning testimony about Teed actually portrayed Cole as a terrible husband, and the case was thrown out, this time with prejudice. Annie Cole remained a Koreshan for years. She eventually married Oliver Teed, the Messiah's brother, and both of them were kicked out of the Unity. With Chicago increasingly turning on the Koreshans, Teed declared that the end was nigh. The war for our souls would be fought at the New Babylon, the 1893 World's Fair and Columbian Exposition. Teed would die a martyr's death, ascend to heaven, then theocratize and return as God incarnate. A Chicago Tribune reporter mockingly asked supporters, "Do you mean to say that you believe Dr. Cyrus R. Teed will go shooting off into heaven like a skyrocket, perhaps from this very porch at numbers 2 and 4 College Place, Chicago?" His immortal manhood was not martyred in 1893, but the relationship between the Koreshan Unity and the local community continued to decline. Teed decided that maybe it was better for the Koreshans to get out of town. In October 1893, Teed and 3 of his closest advisors, including Victoria Gradia and financial backer Bertholdine Boomer, took a trip to Florida to see if they could purchase a hotel in Punta Rasa, just south of Fort Myers, to be the site of their next commune. The price was far more than the Unity could afford, though Teed strung along the owners so that they didn't realize how limited his funds were. In the meantime, he used it as a chance to lecture and distribute literature. A local farmer, Gustav Damkohler, heard about some northerners looking to purchase land and thought his swampfront property in nearby Estero might do. The Koreshans went out to meet him, and what happened next is a matter of some controversy. Either Damkohler had a genuine religious conversion upon meeting the great Koresh, or Teed and his bevy of sirens befuddled Damkohler's mind with some chaste pampering. Whatever the cause, the farmer signed over some 300 acres to the Koreshan Unity for the cut-rate price of $200. The Koreshans also promised to take care of Damkohler and his dotage. Teed was pleased by his new land in Estero. He He declared it to be the Vitellis of the cosmic egg and the site of the New Jerusalem. He envisioned a mighty megalopolis, a city of 10 million people with wide avenues, huge parks, and fantastic infrastructure right out of a Jules Verne novel. He went back to Chicago, and soon a small army of Koreshans were clearing the land and building permanent structures. It was not easy work. The Koreshans were hopeless city slickers with no idea what they were doing, and at first most of the hard work had to be done by Gustav and his son Elwin. But they learned quickly, and over the next few years the property was transformed from swampland into a rustic but comfortable garden community with a general store, post office, an outdoor theater, and a small gallery. For the Koreshans, the humid swampland was a cozy place to unwind, an idyllic break from the heated battles they were constantly fighting in Chicago. They still made plenty of mistakes. At first, they nearly starved because planting was managed by a former Greek and Latin professor who decided to experiment by growing biblically inspired crops that did not prosper in Florida's subtropical climate. The Damkohlers convinced them to switch over to citrus crops at just the right time. In the winter of 1894-1895, an unseasonable cold snap devastated Florida, but everything south of Fort Myers was spared. With oranges in high demand, the Koreshans started pulling in real money, which Teed started spending as soon as it came in, as usual. In its early years, Estero was teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. By this point, some of his followers thought Teed was just optimistic or naive when it came to money, but some others, like Henry Silverfriend, thought he used financial distress as a way of motivating everyone to work harder. Victoria Gradia always had her hands full managing the Unity's debts and shuffling around their property so it couldn't be attached by creditors. The situation eventually stabilized, and the Koreshan Unity embarked on its next venture, scientifically proving once and for all that we lived on the inside of a hollow earth. Leading the effort was Professor Ulysses Grant Morrow, a stenographer and gentleman scientist from Pittsburgh. Morrow had originally been a flat earther, but changed his views after hearing Teed debate Charles Taze Russell. He was appointed the cult's chief astronomer and geodesist. As a former flat earther, Morrow was intimately familiar with experiments that could be used to prove the Earth was round. He also knew, thanks to a quirk of topography, that those experiments were useless because they would produce the same results whether you were on the inside or outside of a sphere. No, there was only one way to do it, to create a truly straight line parallel to the Earth's surface when you started and extend it infinitely. If we were on the outside, the line would rise into the sky. If we were on the inside, it would eventually touch the ground. To conduct the experiment, Morrow created a 12-foot-long T-square, which he called the rectilineator, and developed techniques to ensure that it would stay perfectly level. Essentially, he built multiple rectilineators and just kept moving them in a line and over end, and developed techniques to stabilize them while he built supports. The Koreshans gave the rectilineator a dry run on the shores of Lake Michigan in summer 1896, and took it down to Florida for the final experiment in early 1897. Over several grueling months, a work team meticulously moved the rectilineator several miles over the swamp and beach. When they reached the coast, they extended the line for another few miles with boats and poles, taking sightings through a telescope. Morrow checked and double-checked his calculations and determined the line projected by the rectilineator would enter the Gulf of Mexico about 4 miles from its starting point, meaning the Earth's surface curved upwards. He declared the experiment a success, and Teed included Morrow's experiment design and dataset in his book The Cellular Cosmogony, which detailed the mechanics of Koreshan cosmology. Now, you and I know that we don't live on the inside of the Earth, but Morrow's measurements are well documented and include several levels of redundancy. Even when you account for potential deviation, they prove his hypothesis. How? Well, the primary issue was that the rectilineator was designed poorly. The support columns were too close to the center, allowing the ends to sag even though the entire structure was made of solid mahogany. Morrow had tried to combat any sagging by attaching a metal brace, but it was only secured at the ends, not the center, which only accelerated the process. The deformation was small enough not to be noticed, but every additional section only compounded the initial error. A secondary concern was that the results matched Morrow's hypothesis. As a result of that experimenter bias, he saw no reason to go back and recheck his experimental design. But at some point, Morrow seems to have realized his experiment had flaws and tried to convince the Koreshans to finance refinements to the rectilineator and run another experiment. Teed, though, was satisfied with the existing results, primarily because he had nothing to gain and everything to lose from a rerun. Morrow, realizing his patron cared more for religion than science, quit the group. He still believed the Earth was hollow, but he no longer believed in Cyrus Reed Teed. The next few years were rough for the Koreshan Unity. In 1897, Gustav Damkoller lost his faith in the new Messiah and sued to recover his land, claiming he had been hypnotized by Teed and his woman. Damkoller's lawyers tried to get Koreshan literature entered into the court record, trying to make the case that they were a dangerous cult. Unfortunately for Damkoller, the Koreshans had already won the battle in the court of public opinion by being pleasant and supportive to their neighbors. In the end, he was able to claw back half of his property, which he sold off to fund his retirement. In 1898, a bigger problem moved in just down the road. Notorious spiritualist scam artist Anne Odelia Distabar had tried to join the Koreshan Unity's Chicago Commune in 1895 after serving a 7-year sentence in Joliet prison. She was bounced after a few weeks, but had apparently stolen a ton of their literature and used it to open her own copycat cult, the Order of the Crystal Sea. For a few months, she aggressively tried to steal away Koreshans while simultaneously slandering Teed in the Fort Myers press. Thankfully, at this point, DeBar's name was Mud, and she eventually had to pack up and leave for Europe. At this point, the strain of operating 2 communes proved too much for the Unity. When they lost their lease on Beth Ofra in 1903, the few remaining Chicago Koreshans were relocated to Estero, boosting its population to 200. In 1904, Teed decided that the commune should officially be incorporated as a town. That would allow them to use state tax money to improve the property, most notably the road and post office. To gather local supplies, he allied with Philip Isaacs, the owner of the Fort Myers Press, agreeing that the Koreshans would vote for him as one block if he backed their incorporation. But even Isaacs couldn't stop locals from noticing that the proposed city limits of Estero were about 8 times larger than the land the Koreshans controlled, and included property they didn't own, as well as land on the bottom of Estero Bay. The incorporation passed, but Estero was forced to scale back its actual city limits to a more reasonable size. To celebrate, the Koreshan Unity finally completed construction of their art hall in 1905. It opened with an exhibit by an aesthetic painter of some renown, Douglas Arthur Teed, the Messiah's own son. After being abandoned by his father, Douglas had been taken in by a wealthy widow who had encouraged his talents and sent him to art school in Europe. The exhibit was an attempt at reconciliation, and it failed miserably. Dr. Teed announced he would purchase some of the paintings for $7,500, but never actually paid for them. Douglas tried negotiating with his father, offering to take less than half that amount, or an equivalent value in goods and services. In the end, he was forced to sue to get paid. The 2 men never saw or spoke to each other again. In 1906, the Koreshan Unity ran afoul of their one-time ally Philip Isaacs, now head of the local Democratic Party. Estero wanted a larger share of the county's tax revenues for municipal improvements, but Isaacs was one of those Grover Norquist types who feels that any tax, no matter how small, is a tax too far. When Isaacs realized that some of the Koreshans had crossed party lines to vote for Teddy Roosevelt in 1904, he required all voters in the Democratic primary to sign a pledge asserting they'd never voted for a Republican. When the Koreshans refused to sign, he had their votes invalidated. It made the primary uncomfortably close, and for the first time the Koreshans realized how much power they could wield as a bloc. The Unity's response was to cobble together a shaky coalition of Republicans, marginalized Democratic groups, socialists, and other outsiders. Their Progressive Liberty Party ran a full slate of tickets against Isaac's candidates that November and gave him a serious run for his money. They started their own weekly newspaper, the American Eagle, devoted entirely to attacking Isaacs and the Democratic Party machine. They ran boisterous rallies all across Lee County, backed up by a thunderous brass band. About 6 weeks before the election, one W. W. Pilling arrived in Fort Myers to join the Estero Commune, but no one was there to meet him at the train station. He spent the night in a hotel run by one Colonel Sellers. The next morning, someone from Estero called asking for Pilling and was told by Mrs. Sellers that he wasn't there. Mrs. Sellers meant that Pilling had stepped out for a moment, but the caller apparently understood her response to mean that Pilling hadn't arrived at all. When Pilling returned, Mrs. Sellers called Estero to let them know, and the voice on the other end of the line sounded confused.
I thought you said no one with that name was stopping there.
2 weeks later, W. Ross Wallace, the progressive liberal candidate for county commissioner, spotted Colonel Sellers on the street and said hello. The colonel, who seems to have been a barely contained bundle of rage, accused Wallace of calling his wife a liar and started to beat the ever-living tar out of him. An utterly confused Wallace ran to the mayor and begged for help, but unsurprisingly, the Democratic mayor was not inclined to give him any. Wallace fled town until Sellers could calm down. A few days later, Wallace arranged a meeting with Sellers to explain what had happened and apologize for any inadvertent offense. He also recruited local marshal S.W. Sanchez to mediate. As the three men conversed in front of Gilliam's grocery, Dr. Teed noticed them and decided to butt into the already tense conversation. It was a bad move, and while trying to play peacemaker, he inadvertently called Sellers a liar again. The colonel's hair-trigger temper went off and he started pummeling Teed in the face. Marshal Sanchez, a Democrat, looked on impassively, only intervening when a knife was pulled. Then Teed's bodyguard, a young boxer named Richard Jensch, arrived on the scene with a group of young Koreshans freshly arrived from Baltimore. They fought their way through the gathering crowd and knocked Sellers and Sanchez to the ground. At this point, it became a crazy brawl, which only ended when the Koreshans were beaten senseless. Once they were subdued, Marshal Sanchez slapped the glasses off Teed's face, accused the Koreshans of throwing the first punch, and threw them all in jail. Teed posted a $10 bond and wisely chose to skip his court appearance the following Monday. Teed was hung in effigy by angry Fort Myers residents, and the Progressive Liberal Party was soundly defeated on Election Day. Actually, they did quite well in rural communities, but were crushed in Fort Myers, which had more votes than the rest of the county combined. Philip Isaac celebrated by revoking Estero's Articles of Incorporation, though that was later ruled unconstitutional. After the beating, Teed was in constant pain and confined to a wheelchair. For over a year, he was confined to the commune, and his condition was hidden from Koreshans outside of Estero. He could no longer lecture and traveled only once to try and establish a commune in Washington, D.C., but his condition worsened and he quickly returned to Florida. He spent his days as a bedridden invalid, dependent on his personal nurse to give him saltwater baths and electrotherapy treatments. On the morning of December 22, 1908, Teed asked for a teaspoon of salt, declaring, "Every sacrifice should be purified." He had 3 small tastes of salt and died an hour later. Koreshans were elated, thinking Teed would rise from the dead by Christmas to usher in the new millennium. His body was moved into a zinc bathtub, and the community marveled as over the next few days it blackened and bloated. Some believers even fancied they could see his old body taking shallow breaths, or a new body forming just beneath the skin of the old. Nothing spectacular or supernatural was happening. Teed's body was just decomposing rapidly in the sweltering Florida heat. When county health officials got word of Teed's passing a few days later, they rushed to Estero, hastily signed a death certificate, and forced them to bury the body. The Koreshan Unity built a simple stone tomb on Estero Island and dumped the bathtub with Teed's body inside. The headstone had no birth or death dates, and inside the tomb they hid a note. In compliance with the law, and only for such reason, the body of Cyrus R. Teed is placed in this stone vault. We, the disciples of Koresh, Shepherd, Stone of Israel, know that this sepulchre cannot hold his body, for he will overcome death, and in his immortal body will rise triumphant from the tomb. Anastasia. In compliance with the law, and only for such reason, the body of Cyrus R. Teed is placed in this stone vault. We, the disciples of Koresh, Shepherd, Stone of Israel, know that this sepulchre cannot hold his body, for he will overcome death, and in his immortal body will rise triumphant from the tomb. Anastasia. When, after several weeks, Teed's immortal body still hadn't risen triumphant from the tomb, the Koreshan Unity started poring over the sacred text to figure out what might happen next. It turned out Teed's descriptions of his theocrasis were vague and contradictory. Was it a physical transformation, a spiritual transformation, or both? Would it happen shortly? Had it already happened and no one noticed? If it had happened, Victoria Gradia should be the new leader. But if it hadn't happened, was she still divine? And what if it never happened? Here Victoria's personal unpopularity worked against her, and many Koreshans refused to recognize her authority. She eventually tired of fighting and left the commune to marry a dentist, Dr. Addison Graves. Gustav Faber, Teed's nurse, claimed that Teed had passed the divine spark to him shortly before dying, but no one believed him. A recent convert, Edgar Pisart, made the same claim, and they believed him even less because Pisart changed religions more often than he changed his clothes. And also they had caught him out on Estero Island trying to conduct a seance with Teed's corpse, which was tantamount to declaring that Teed was dead. No. Some members of the Unity, including W. Ross Wallace, moved into Fort Myers proper and started a short-lived splinter group. Others turned to Ulysses Morrow to lead them, but he refused. The mantle of leadership eventually settled on one of Teed's longtime financial backers, Henry Silverfriend. No one ever believed Silverfriend was divine, but he was an able manager and kept the commune afloat during the lean years that followed. When Silverfriend grew feeble-minded, he was replaced by Allen Andrews, the son of Teed's longtime confidant Dr. A.W.K. Andrews. No one liked Allen, but no one else wanted the responsibility either. By the 1930s, the aging Unity could no longer participate in agriculture, but managed to survive off the revenues from their general store, gas station, and trailer park. The commune's already small numbers started to dwindle, and only 55 full-time residents remained. The few Koreshans who didn't live on the commune preferred to stay away because they found the place decrepit and depressing. Teed's ideas, though, continued to propagate, even though the Unity no longer sent out missionaries. Most notably, German writers like Peter Bender corresponded with the Koreshans and expanded on Teed's ideas to create a more complicated Hohlweltare or Hollow Earth doctrine. Influenced by their writings, Adolf Hitler even sent a small fleet to the Baltic to look upwards with powerful telescopes and see if they could spot the movements of the British Navy in the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, okay, there's no actual documentary evidence that last one ever happened, but it's such a juicy bit I just had to mention it. Teed's works also found their way into the hands of a young Jewish schoolteacher, Hedwig Michel. A colleague handed her a copy of the Cellular Cosmogony, which she found fascinating. When she was forced to flee the pogroms in Germany, she wrote to the Koreshan Unity and was invited to come stay with them. When Michel arrived in Estero, there were only about a dozen Koreshans left, and the commune was in serious disrepair. Alan Andrews was more interested in driving fast cars and writing cranky letters to the Fort Myers press than actually running the place. Fires and other disasters destroyed buildings one by one, and no one made a move to replace or repair them. Our horrified Michel organized the ouster of Alan, and the two of them spent years fighting for control of Estero. Michel was ultimately triumphant, but she too practiced a benign neglect in her management of the community. She kept the place running out of gratitude for the Koreshans' hospitality, not because she was a believer. In 1961, she deeded the commune's land to the state for historical preservation, provided that Michel and the 3 remaining Koreshans could live on it until their death. When Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969, the last surviving Koreshan, 90-year-old Vera Newcomb, finally lost her faith. But she had nowhere else to go, and died on the commune in 1974. Michel hung on for another 8 years, finally passing in 1982. Today, you can visit the surviving structures at Koreshan State Park. As for Dr. Cyrus Reed Teed himself, well, in October 1901, a mighty hurricane hit Estero Island and washed his mausoleum into the Gulf. The headstone floated ashore afterwards, but everything else was lost. Maybe Teed is still floating out there in a zinc bathtub, waiting for the right moment to return and save us all. Let's talk sources. Obviously, if you can find them, check out the works of Teed himself because they are entertainingly bonkers. You can find copies of The Illumination of Koresh, The Immortal Manhood, and the Cellular Cosmogony over at the International Association for the Preservation of Spiritualist and Occult Periodicals, which I absolutely adore. AAPSOP also has a nearly complete archive of The Flaming Sword, including some issues that were personally owned by Gustav Faber. Also invaluable were Adam Morris's American Messiahs and Lynn Millner's The Allure of Immortality, with both do an incredible job of bringing Teed and Koreshanity to life for a modern audience. If you're interested in fictional depictions of Koreshanity, I heartily recommend Amy Thomas's The Adventure of the Koreshan Unity, which puts Sherlock Holmes to work solving the mystery of Teed's murder. You can find it in the anthology, The Sign of the Seven. And now, some connections. And boy, we have more for this episode than any we've had before. Teed, of course, was a great admirer of George Rapp and his Harmony Society, and even tried to merge them into his proposed Union of Celibate Societies. We covered the Harmony Society's history in our Series 2 episodes, Hold Fast What Thou Hast, and That No Man Take Thy Crown. Notorious scam artist Anodelia Dis DeBar briefly tried to join the Koreshan Unity, and later tried to directly compete with them by opening her own copycat commune right down the road. Dis DeBar was the subject of our Series 3 episode, Spirit Princess. Ulysses Grant Morrow studied geodetics so he could prove that we lived on the inside of the hollow earth. You can also use geodetics to determine the exact geographical center of something. We talked about the various geographic centers of North America in our very last episode, The Centers of All Things. And now a few quick notes. This is the last episode of our 4th series, and also the last episode of our 1st year! Happy birthday to us! It's been a crazy year, and we're going to celebrate by taking a short break to recharge our batteries. We'll be back with the first episode of Series 5 on September 14th. In the meantime, I know I mention it at the end of every episode, but if you know some secret mysteries that you'd like to share with the world, we'd love to help you share them. Our secret society is always recruiting. Just go to our website, orderofthejackalope.com, and click on Join Us for more info. New members get a coupon for a free hug and a day's supply of rice-a-roni, the San Francisco treat. If only I could get rid of this damn... Wait, where'd the birdsong go? When did that happen? Where'd that door come from? Hello? This episode was produced by David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope podcast and is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. The script of this episode, along with sources, links, and more, can be found on our website at orderofthejackalope.com. That's orderofthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. You can keep up with our research, release schedule, and more on our social media accounts. We can be found at Order Jackalope on Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and Reddit. That's Order Jackalope without hyphens because our branding is terribly inconsistent. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, or your enemies, or total strangers. We're not picky. Hey, you! Want to join the fastest growing secret society in the nation? Of course you do. But before you can be initiated into the hidden secrets, you gotta share a hidden secret of your own. Visit our website at orderthejackalope.com for more information.